From Carnegie, China, this is China in the World. Engaging leading scholars and former policymakers on China's foreign policy and evolving global role. Brought to you by the East Asia-based Center of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
Welcome to this season of Carnegie China's China in the World podcast, where we will be exploring how states in East Asia manage their multifaceted security and economic concerns as they engage with the People's Republic of China. My name is Ian Chong. I'm a non-resident scholar with Carnegie China and an associate professor of political science at the National University of Singapore. Today, we turn our attention to Vietnam, the PRC's southern neighbor. With us today, Deputy Director of the Asia Program at the International Crisis Group, Hung Le Thu, who's an old friend of mine. She's been working in international security and foreign policy, involved in Track 1.5, Track 2 dialogues with academia, think tanks, governments, international organizations. Also with us is Dr. Nguyen Cat Giang, who's a visiting fellow at the Vietnamese Studies Program at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. He formerly served as the head of the political research unit of the Hanoi-based Vietnam Institute for Economic and Policy Research.
Hi, Ian. Good to be with you, and hello to the listeners.
Hi, Ian. Hi, Chị Hương. Many thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Thanks so much to both of you for joining us. All right, let's dive right in. So Vietnam has had a very long and very complex relationship with China in its various forms across its various governments and empires. So how would you characterize Vietnam's economic relationship with the People's Republic of China today? Bearing in mind that, you have rivers that originate from the PRC that affects livelihoods and ecosystems. You have also been a beneficiary of the past China Plus One strategies. You also have, a burgeoning relationship with PRC firms starting to relocate in Vietnam. Who'd like to start?
Yeah, sure. I think it's Vietnam-China economic relation is very complex one, similar to its political bilateral ties. But I think if I can say one sentence about their bilateral economic tie, I think it's a textbook North-South dependency model. So in a way that Vietnam exports mainly raw materials, including half of its agricultural products to China. And in exchange, it receives a lot of Chinese ready-made products, intermediaries for its manufacturing base. And so I think it's very classic model of North-South economic relationship. And despite the political tensions between two countries in the past few decades, Vietnam still see China as its biggest trade partner. So it depends a lot on Chinese import, not only for consumption, but also for manufacturing capability. But of course, it also raises a very big problem of Vietnam's widening trade deficit with China, now rising to about $80 billion in 2024. And of course, it's also raised suspicions from Washington about Vietnam serving as a rerouting hub for Chinese goods. So I think it's complex. It's not South dependency model, but there's more to come when Vietnam is trying to change its economic model to a more domestically based economic growth in the coming years.
So when we talk about political economy in China-Vietnam relations, the word political, the component political is a very important one. And then I would even stress it more than in regular cases, because it is the security concerns, the political concerns that will always weigh in Vietnam's economic decisions when it comes to relations with China. And those security concerns are not going to go anywhere. They are at the core of Vietnam's national interest. We're talking about the overlapping territorial disputes in South China Sea. We're talking about, Ian, you already mentioned the other resources of the shared Mekong River, for example, with China, but also other Southeast Asian axis as well. And the sheer fact that China is so big and just next door, and there has been history of previous historical invasions, makes the question of security very real. It's not inconceivable that the relations can be in a very bad point. It has happened in the recent living memory, where the two neighbors, even with a shared ideology, had gone through an open war with each other. But coming back to the question of economy, there's this push and pull, as Zhang already painted the picture. The pull is very strong. China being the economic center is a matter for the whole region, not only Vietnam. The push, I mentioned already, the security aspect, but also the fact that it is a very imbalanced relations. Vietnam's economy is just a fraction of China's, and it has a growing trade deficit with China, and the manufacturing capacity is always going to be only a fraction of that of China. So there are a lot of risks there of dependency. And on top of all of that very complex picture, we have now Trump's tariffs that he announced in April. And while we are still in the period of 90 days waiting for what happens next, at least other countries outside of China, Vietnam, like other developing countries, has been quite listed as a quite high tariff. So Vietnam is 46% at this point. And should the tariff really take place, it will affect the global trading system overall.
So this is something that I'd like to bring up. Clearly, the tariffs imposed by the United States and also the trade war between the U.S. and the PRC does upend a lot of existing economic relationships. So, Xiang, you had talked about the trade deficit. A lot of other Southeast Asian countries have talked about how already before the tariffs, the first round of the trade war has led to a diversion of trade, especially exports, from the PRC to various markets in Southeast Asia. Does Vietnam feel this? Does Vietnam also feel the overcapacity issue that is putting pressure on small and medium-sized enterprises because of that trade diversion?
Well, I think that's obviously one of the biggest concerns for the Vietnamese leadership in Hanoi when President Xi Jinping visited in mid-April, because there has been a lot of discussion about how China should try to reduce the flux of Chinese exports into Vietnam, especially in manufacturing stuff that Vietnam can produce, because it can really challenge Vietnam's aspiration to build its manufacturing capability in the future. And I think there's a lot of evidence, at least from my personal experience with all my friends doing businesses in Vietnam, and they, for the past few years, especially after COVID, as they face a lot of difficulties in competing with the floods of very cheap Chinese goods, mostly consumer goods, exporting directly to Vietnam, either via some e-commerce sites or via cross-border trade routes, that make it really hard for local and for Vietnamese small and medium-sized enterprises to compete. And obviously that's a very big concern for Hanoi. And during the Chinese President Xi Jinping visit in Hanoi, both sides emphasized the need for China first to increase the import of Vietnam's high quality products, not just agricultural products, but Vietnamese ready-made goods that can be exported to China. But secondly, and more importantly, for China to try to reduce the trade imbalance, the growing trade imbalance between Vietnam and China for the past decade. I think the promises are there, but it's extremely hard to really solve the issues in the short term, because, like I said, it's very classic North-South dependency model. And if China continue to depend on export as a main engine of economic growth and find it difficult to reorient its economy to a more consumption-based economy as wished or expected by Chinese President Xi Jinping, and then Vietnam and other Southeast Asian economies, much smaller scales, I think would still be very vulnerable to the excess capacity export from China.
Could you both also talk to us a little bit about the memoranda of understanding that came with President Xi Jinping or Secretary General Xi Jinping's visits to Vietnam recently?
So there had been a astounding number of agreement reportedly signed during that visit. Some quote a number in the 40s, 42 agreements. But in fact, we don't see those agreements publicly available. We can't judge the degree of details and, some degrees of concrete agreement between the two countries. Analysts say that those are some have been in negotiation for years, and they were just using this diplomatic moment to showcase how productive the bilateral relations are, and that they are not necessarily very much detailed or binding for that matter. But one I think widely spoke about agreement, also had been in negotiation for some time, is the railway project between the two countries. Something obviously of strategic importance as well. So we don't know whether the negotiation over the years had been inching closer really to that agreement, or was it really a change of heart on the part of Hanoi that felt pressure from the tariffs, and had to seek alternatives for improvement with China. I think that all comes to details, and we not necessarily have all of that publicly available. But I do wanted to stress that Zhang already mentioned Vietnam has been trying to get away from the dependency or reduce the dependency on Chinese production parts, and of course reduce the trade deficit. I think the tariffs have thrown a curveball. China will be seeking alternative markets as well to compensate for what it could have sent to US and the huge production surplus that it would have anyways. And Southeast Asia is a very natural direction. It's a huge market, a big population. It's easily accessible. Of course, it alone will not replace, and China is looking elsewhere as well, Africa, Latin America, Europe, and so on and so forth. But there's a huge risk for Vietnam and other countries to be flooded with Chinese products that are much of cheaper prices, and Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries don't have a very good mechanism of anti-dumping, and some countries have taken measures, but it will be very hard to enforce. It has been hard already. It will be even harder, especially with new connectivity such as railway and so on and so forth.
Want more on China's economic trajectory? China's Reform Imperative examines China's economic reforms and their impacts on the global economy. Curated by Carnegie China Senior Fellow Michael Pettis, China's Reform Imperative will focus on China's reform progress and on the challenges and opportunities Beijing faces along the way. Go to carnegieendowment.org/China-reform-imperative for more information.
Apart from the trade, Vietnam has this fairly complex set of security relationships with the People's Republic of China. There is the historical memory of conflict and tension, and in fact occupation from successive Chinese dynasties previously, and currently the Mekong itself is a security issue, as are the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. And recently, there was also a live fire exercise in disputed waters. How do you see the security side of that relationship? And then we'll try to bring the two sides together.
Yeah, I think it's like Chi Hương already said, it's very important when we talk about economic security. We also have to link with political security that the Vietnamese leadership in Hanoi really worry about the growing threat of China. I think there are three main security concerns that Vietnam currently holds against China. The first one, obviously, the South China Sea disputes, including the territorial disputes and the maritime disputes. The second one, I think, but less visible, is the concerns about political interference. And when you talk about the persistent mistrust of Vietnam toward China because of their centuries of domination and colonialism as well. I think it paints a really complex picture of memories, traumas to generations of Vietnamese leadership, and it's not easily erased just by a few decades of communist alignment. And third, I think Vietnam also fears about being strategically encircled. We talk a lot about China's fear of being contained by US and US allies, but for Vietnam, it also feels contained or encircled by China itself. Because if you look at the Vietnamese borders, it's circled by China and its two traditional allies in Cambodia and Laos. But for the past decade, Beijing has been increasingly influence the politics in Cambodia and Laos, and even some said that maybe those two countries are becoming more and more satellite states for Beijing. And Hanoi is extremely concerning for its security because if Beijing really secures the influence in Cambodia and Laos, and then with the South China Sea, Vietnam basically encircled by Beijing's or Beijing allies. So for this, it's extremely an existential threat for Vietnam. We don't, even talk about the non-traditional security threats like the Mekong, like the, excess capacity export. So for all of that, very complex issues for Vietnam, security issues, I think, play very, very important part in their consideration of its economic partnership with China. So that's the reason why for Vietnam, it is among the last countries in ASEAN to accept, being included in China's community with shared future, and also one of the very few countries in Asia that has been consistently registered to receiving a lot of Chinese Belt Road Initiative projects. So I think it's very important for us to think about their concerns that the leadership in Hanoi thinks about Chinese security threat.
Hung, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think Zhang captured it pretty well. It is, I think the challenge are really coming from multiple fronts at the same time. I think that's the biggest challenge, because Vietnam cannot afford just keeping an eye on one direction without losing a pulse of another. So we discuss about, for example, influx of Chinese product maybe coming from China directly, but it may be also the case it comes from other surrounding neighbors in Southeast Asia, like Cambodia or Laos. The transit of the goods and porous borders are also a concern that Vietnam needs to consider. As I mentioned already, the Cambodia factor, it's always been there, and it's going to also pose a challenge for Vietnamese national security. So Vietnam feels China's presence in its direct neighborhood in the mainland Southeast Asia, but also more broader. I think China's role and presence in Southeast Asian region at the multilateral grouping of Association of Southeast Asian Nations. But there is another complexity to that, because Vietnam's party system is so similar as well to Chinese one. Of course, there are significant differences. But no one is going to deny the fact that Vietnam's anti-corruption campaign also takes lessons and notes from China's anti-corruption campaign. There will be differences there, and they're not executed the same, but it is watching what Beijing is doing. And, that party-to-party relations will remain close regardless of the security challenges, of economic challenges, and because they legitimize the regime in both countries. So it is in their best interest to keep the party-to-party relations very strong. And in fact, I think Vietnam is perhaps the only one, maybe outside of Laos, that have so-called 3+3 meetings on regular basis with China. In case of Vietnam and China, we have, of course, defense and foreign ministers, but also party leadership, party representative.
I'm also wondering then, now we've talked about the economics and the security side, how do you think Vietnam is trying or, doing in terms of trying to juggle these two different sets of overlapping concerns? Xiang?
Well, I think it's extremely complex, and I think I read one line from Chị Hương article mentioned about Vietnamese officials saying that if you are a Vietnamese leader, you must know when to show your hand to the Chinese, to shake hand, and when to stand up to the Chinese in order to protect Vietnam's sovereignty. So I think it's really hard because if you look at the domestic situation in Vietnam, where the Vietnam nationalism is always connected to, the anti-Chinese sentiments. So any moves from the government that move too close to the Chinese side would be judged as pro-Chinese. But if the Vietnamese is moving too far away from the Chinese, I think it could be a very big risk as well, because obviously China still plays a very important role economically and politically for Vietnam. So the question is how to balance, the water should not be too hot, but also should not be too cold for Vietnam to maintain a good distance between China and at the same time benefits from not only, having a good economic partnership with China, but also having, a lot of things to learn from China as the only communist regime in the world right now that Vietnam can have something to learn about. So for that, I think it's important to put into the context of Vietnam geopolitical hedging, and obviously the immensely improved bilateral tie with U.S. for the past decade has played a very important role for Vietnam to maintain a good ties with China. So I think for Vietnam, you cannot really judge is balancing with China without taking into account of Vietnam's tie with the West, especially with the United States, because Vietnam sees the United States as the only external power with capability to counter China's growing influence on the region, and also can help Vietnam to counterbalance Chinese, perceived threats, both in terms of security and in terms of economic dominance in the region. So I think it's a very interesting period to see when the United States under the second Trump administration seemingly withdraw from their own order, especially in the Asia Pacific. It will make it much harder for Vietnam to play the balancing game between China and the West in order to maintain its strategic autonomy, like we said. So I think one very important aspect of Vietnam's upcoming balancing game is how they can really play a more important role in ASEAN, and in a way to push ASEAN and other regional multilateral platforms in order for Vietnam to find a third way to balance with China without moving too close to the U.S., or without depending too much on the U.S. Under the very unpredictable administration.
That's right. And it's going to be even more challenging because that balance is going to be continuously changing, and it's a dynamic one. So it requires a lot of effort has defined that position for countries like Vietnam. But when the balance constantly change as well between the major powers, countries like Vietnam will constantly need to be updating and upgrading their strategies. But Ian, to come back to your original question, I think Vietnam's strategy is based on so-called the duality of cooperation and struggle, right? So cooperate when they can, and where the interest serves. We mentioned about for example, party, but also dynamically blooming economic relations, and for example, even joint exercises despite the maritime exercises, despite the ongoing maritime disputes, and struggle when they need to really assert their national interest and not give an inch of it. So it's a constant duality in that really tango, cooperation and struggle. And with that, Vietnam developed so-called, that bamboo diplomacy, where it may be, comparatively small and thin to other big plants and big trees, but it's flexible. It can bend under the pressure, but it can bounce back as well.
How actually does the current unpredictability of U.S. policy affect Vietnam's ability and goals in terms of trying to work with China?
Well, I think it's very important to note that Vietnam has been extremely successful in the past few decades after the market reform, because it's moved from very closed country and economy to an extremely open economy with its trade to GDP ratio being around 200%. I think it's only second to Singapore in Asia. So it benefited a lot from the from the era of globalization and trade. So for Vietnam, when with a very unpredictable administration and the change that it made into the global trade system, Vietnam has to really rethink about its growth model, because for the past few decades, it depends on both China as a major import source for its manufacturing inputs, and depending on the West, especially the United States, for its export market, accounting for 30% of Vietnam's export. So for that, Vietnam cannot really depend on the old model of, serving as a bridge between China and the US in terms of, economic link. It must find another way in order to, develop a new engine for its economic growth. And one aspect of that is for Vietnam to really recalibrate its regional partnerships with other countries in ASEAN, especially trying to push for a greater integration in ASEAN economic community. And second, to find, a better balance with other trade partners, including South Korea, Japan, and European Union. And third, more importantly, I think since the new leader of Vietnam, General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam, Tô Lâm, came into power last August, he has been trying to pivot Vietnam's economic model from an export dependence model to a more, dependence on domestically produced goods and domestically grown model by pushing for policies that encourage private sectors to develop.
Yes, I think China's message to the world and to Southeast Asia in the recent visit of Secretary General President Xi Jinping to the region and to Vietnam, I think is a strong message, which is China is the stable one. China is the predictable one, and versus the US, who is currently very unpredictable. And it tends to be that the threat unknown is raising more alert than threat known, even if China is not going to be any less of a threat to Vietnam in terms of security concern, or it will not deviate from its national interest, advancing its national interest, and we see its capability to do so. But at least we understand, or Vietnam, I think, understand as well, what are China's interest, what it is, inching closer towards what it is advancing, where it is advancing its interest. Whereas with United States, it's really hard to say, and that puts everyone, including Vietnam, on the very anxious in a very anxious position. Having said that, though, I think Vietnam was one of rare ones that managed to actually go through to the White House after the Liberation Day tariff announcement to convey the willingness to negotiate, to convey, the willingness to be sitting and discussing those tariffs, or also adjusting the trade imbalance that Vietnam had with the US. So there are other news. I think Vietnam has worked for many years to that position where it can actually get in touch with even the unpredictable administrations such as Trump. You saw President Xi visiting Vietnam as the first stop in his Southeast Asian tour, which we've discussed. But also what we haven't discussed is Prime Ministers of Japan, Ishiba's recent trip soon after to the region, also to Vietnam and the Philippines. So Vietnam, and also quite recently, there was an upgrade in Australia, New Zealand, and ASEAN trade relations, which Vietnam is a part of. So you can see that Vietnam has building up its way to its security network, so to speak, to be, protecting itself from over-reliance on anyone and be well integrated in the global system, in the regional both trade and security systems.
What sort of obstacles, challenges, tensions do you see for the Vietnam PRC relationship going forward?
Well, I think it's important to look at the broader picture. For Vietnam, being close to China is both a blessing and a curse of geography, because we cannot really choose our neighbors. So Vietnam must work with what it has. So for Vietnam, it's important to maintain a good balance. When talking about Vietnam's position with China, I often think about Icarus, a Greek mythology. So in a way that you have wings and you want to fly very, very high to the sky. But if you fly too close to the sun, you get burned and then you fall down to your death. But if you fly too far away, you not getting warm enough to heat your body. So for Vietnam, it's important to maintain good distance with China, and how to balance its own domestic concerns with its foreign policy concerns. So in order to gain the best of its very, very unique geopolitical position vis-a-vis China, to work for its national strategy.
The Mexicans have a very good saying when they describe relations with the US, which is, poor Mexico, too far from God and too close to the United States. And I think you can swap Vietnam and China in terms of, too close to China. I think, it is going to be a precarious era ahead of us. The baseline national interests are going to clash over the South China Sea, over the resources, the Mekong, and so on and so forth. That's not going anywhere, neither either countries, but they have coexisted for thousands of years. And this is but another chapter, right? I would stress that, China may be picturing itself right now as an alternative and positive alternative from the United States, but China's economy is not doing well either. And in fact, the Vietnamese leaders will tell you that Vietnam is afraid of a strong China, but also is afraid of a weak China, perhaps even more so, because at that point there are other risks, including unstable China, unpredictability of its actions, and other things at stake at that time.
Great. Thank you both. So we've had a very fascinating, in-depth look at Vietnam's very complex relationship with the PRC from Giang and Huong, who have been really excellent presenters on this episode. So I'd like to thank both of them, and I appreciate everyone who's tuned in and listened to us. Thank you all so much.
Listening to the China and the World podcast, a production of Carnegie China, the East Asia-based center of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed are those of the host and guest panelists, and not necessarily those of Carnegie China or the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Subscribe to the China and the World podcast on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more about Carnegie China at carnegiechina.org. Tim Martin is our audio engineer and producer, with help from Heewon Park and Wan Yi Du.